Hello everyone, answering some questions here for you. First questions first. Yes, I am wearing a hat. That is because I'm now cool. That's what's happened. Yep, I went away, I had a think, and I decided to become cool, and I decided to wear this hat. Nothing to do with the fact that I haven't put any hair gel in my hair, and my hair does not suit not having any hair gel in it. Totally the cool thing. So that's the first question, probably the most important, the deepest theological one, and thank you for asking it. I know none of you technically put it in. You didn't know I was going to be wearing a hat, so to be fair, that would have been an incredible question to ask. Nonetheless, that is question one out of the way. Other questions, right, let me go through. So Josh, you've asked about baptism and the early church believing that baptism was necessary. Few things on that. So there are some quotes. I could find 4 from church fathers in the first sort of 300-400 years of church history, essentially saying that baptism was necessary. So you can find quotes that say that. Let me throw out a response to that. Firstly, why I think it's incorrect, but secondly, also why why this definitely was not actually the universal position of the early church. So those that believe that, they were generally, okay, we've got a really early one from Irenaeus. That one, his theology is incorrect. He's talking about John 3, talking about being born of water and of spirit. Nicodemus, who Jesus is talking to in that passage, would not have taken that as being anything to do with baptism. I don't think he would have understood New Testament church baptism, what with it not existing at that point in time. Obviously, you did have John baptizing, but I don't believe that that's something that he would have taken from it. He would have gone to the passage in Ezekiel about God saying that he would gather his people. Ezekiel 36, he's going to gather his people, pour clean water on them, and he will give them a new heart and a new spirit. So you have that water and spirit in Ezekiel. That's almost certainly what Nicodemus would have understood, which is why the early church fathers, in particular Irenaeus of, which Irenaeus is it? Irenaeus of Lyon, I think. I'm guessing from the timeline. There's a couple of Irenaeusai in the early church, but anyway. So I think he's incorrect. The others, so you got Origen and Tertullian are the others that I could find. Origen and Tertullian had some slightly dodgy theology. Anyway, particularly Origen. They were from the Alexandrian school of theology. This is a bit of church history, but there are 2 schools of theology that sort of developed, Alexandrian and the school of Antioch. Antioch would be more reliable, probably more akin to how we would interpret the Bible, broadly speaking. Alexandrian school got into these metaphorical approaches and so on. So I'm not overly worried about them. Here's why I don't believe that this was the universal belief of the early church. And that's because the practice of the early church clearly shows that they did not believe that baptism was necessary for salvation. So about 150 AD, you had essentially a fairly standardized baptismal process that involved 3 stages. So you had someone basically assenting to the faith, doing what we would broadly consider to be a salvation response of some sort. And people go, yep, praise God, wonderful, we consider you a Christian. But they wouldn't get baptized immediately. Now, in the New Testament, they did. I have no problem with getting baptized immediately. But we're talking about the beliefs of the early church, so that's why we have to address this. Then they would go on to the second stage of that baptismal process, which was essentially a probationary stage. They would watch their lives. They would see for patterns of sin. Justin Martyr talks about looking for sorrow of sin, learning and accepting the church's teachings, and transforming one's life as being key things in this stage. And then they would go on to the third stage, which would basically be a sort of baptismal class and becoming actually baptized. And they had a way of doing that involved honey and white garments. They had a nice little way of doing this. I have no problem with any of that. But I think you can see that the general practice of the early church clearly shows that they did not believe baptism to be necessary for salvation. So even though you do have some quotes that say that, the broad practice of the church doesn't show that. And I think sometimes we assume too much of a monolithic idea about and all periods of church history that are not our own. If you said, what is the church's opinion on baptism today? Yeah, well, who are you talking about? Presbyterians, Anglicans, Methodists, woke whatevers, hardcore Reformed Baptists, Charismatics. There'll be differences there. The same is actually quite true throughout church history. People with differences of opinions. You can find some quotes where they say that, quotes which I think are incorrect, but of course you can find quotes that say that, but the broad practice of the early church shows that they didn't actually believe that. There's reasons why I think the Bible doesn't teach that. I think 2 Peter talks about being saved through water, and it talks about basically that it's not the removal of dirt from the body, but a purity of conscience towards God. So he's saying the water's not the essential thing. The physical water is not the thing. It is the spiritual reality, the internal work behind that. That is the key thing. I think it's also interesting that Jesus didn't baptize anyone, his disciples did, but even that period was very short, and yet he clearly called people to repentance and faith. That's what he did, and assumingly later on they got baptized by the apostles or whatever church they ended up being part of as these things progressed. But Jesus didn't do a lot of baptizing in his ministry. He did do some, but didn't do a lot. And so I think you have some good reasons from the Bible. Clearly, that doesn't seem to be the completely necessary for salvation. One big hole in that theology that I think you can find is that if baptism saves, then it becomes very hard to excommunicate anyone who is baptized. Right? So excommunication is this idea that we don't actually accept your profession of faith. Now, we don't consider ourselves to be the ultimate judge of that, but when a church decides, look, your lifestyle or your espoused beliefs are not reflective of what we teach, to the extent that we really don't think you're a Christian in good standing with the church at least, but we probably are questioning your faith. Very hard to do that if baptism and salvation are synonymous. You can't get there. It's like saying, I'm come up with some analogy at some point. It's like saying, well, if you wear an Arsenal shirt, you're an Arsenal player, but you don't actually ever show up, never train, don't get paid by Arsenal. Right? Okay, well then you're not actually an Arsenal player. You might have the shirt, but that's not the thing that defines you. All Arsenal players should have Arsenal shirts. Not all people who have Arsenal shirts are Arsenal players. So roughly that idea. Excommunication has always been practiced. It has been done to baptize people. So that again is a big hole in that idea of baptism being the same as salvation. That said, I do have a real problem in the modern church, which I think is a bigger problem for most people, in that we don't actually seem to be very interested in obeying that commandment to be baptized. We definitely should. Jesus commands us to be baptized. I think we under-recognize the importance of the physical in the church today. We under-recognize the power of symbolism to do genuinely powerful spiritual things. We're very materialistic, and by that I don't mean buying stuff. I mean that the material is all there is, and that's sort of maybe it's not materialism, it's not quite the right term for that, but we're very, it really goes back to Kant in theology, in philosophy, where you have this idea of the sort of secret spiritual and the material being distinct, right? And there's sort of this internal reality, but the external really has nothing to do with that. The Bible does not have that worldview. We tend to have that worldview, incorrectly so. So it really matters. Baptism is a command given to all Christians, and it is the easiest thing that Jesus will ever ask any of us to do. There's nothing easier than that when it comes to salvation. Go into some water and come out again as a sign of your faith, you're dying to self, raised to new life in Christ, all of the stuff the Bible does talk about in that area. And so I see good reason why it can be termed synonymously, because it is actually the salvation practical response, right? The lifting a hand in a prayer meeting, the saying the sinner's prayer, not in the Bible. Baptism, definitely in the Bible. So Christians should all get baptized. And if you will not obey Jesus' command to get baptized, well, every other command is more difficult. So it's a real problem, and it shows a lack of if you understand it, if you've heard that, which you should hear of, but if you have heard that and you understood that and you won't do it, you've got a problem in your faith. Like, legitimately, if you will not obey that commandment, the easiest commandment Jesus will ever give you, unlikely to obey the more difficult ones. So, that's that. The Shroud of Turin, right, what do I think about the Shroud of Turin? Is it authentic? Yada yada. Sorry, I said yada yada. This is a very seriously well-worded question, but I don't have it written in front of me. I just have my kind of quick notes. It's not something I've ever particularly looked into in detail until this question, so not answering this as an expert on it. It may be authentic. Part of me finds it a little bit too good to be authentic. Like, sometimes these things are like, that seems like too good to be true. So, if you were faking it, that's what you would do. And I just can't imagine things being quite as pristine as that. This was a hastily done burial. I don't know. I'm iffy on it, but I'm not opposed to the idea. The implications of it are zero. There are no implications of that for the Christian life whatsoever that I can see from the Bible or anywhere else. It has no more implication for us than which exact tomb was Jesus laid in. It actually doesn't matter. When you look at the wording of Jesus, you see what he says he left us. He doesn't talk anything about relics, doesn't talk about anything of his personhood, his clothing at the time, which would have been more interesting than his shroud, the clothing that people touched and got healed of. He doesn't give them any of that stuff. The Bible doesn't. I mean, you might have some OT, Old Testament relics occasionally, but in the New Testament, what does Jesus leave us with? Well, he says, "I'm sending my Spirit. I give you my words. Like, you're going to remember the words. And I'm sending my Holy Spirit to be with you." That's what you should be excited about. The apostles don't teach anything about relics of Jesus. The apostles don't talk about this. I can't imagine someone saving this. Like, you just put yourself in that context. You've got the grave clothes there. You would think, well, this is obviously awesome. I can understand them keeping it, but implications for the life of a Christian, none. Like, just they don't exist. I can't find any reason in the Bible. And particularly in the New Testament, we move away largely from sacred objects towards sacred people. The external becomes internal. Not entirely, but in many ways. And if it is the piece of cloth that Jesus was wrapped in, interesting archaeological evidence and no more. That's what it is. I would happily go see it. I would be interested in seeing it. I have heard of stories of people touching relics and being healed and so on. I'm actually not totally opposed to that. It is suddenly had a gale force wind go on outside whilst I'm recording this. I don't know if you can hear that, but is this the wrath of God? Am I wrong about the Shroud of Turin, Lord? Please, forgive me. It's not dying down, so I'm assuming that it's just wind. Anyway. The Death of the Apostles, the best thing on that I found is by Sean McDowell, as he would be called in America. Big Sean, as I like to call him, because we're tight. I've never met Sean McDowell. He has never heard of me. He's never watched this channel. Gavin Ortland has, though. Gavin Ortland used my channel in a video. He turned the speed up, which made me sound like I was on helium, but nonetheless he did use it and liked it and responded to my comments, so that's nice because this channel is still tiny, but yes, exciting. There's that one. So Death of the Apostles, best thing on it is Sean McDowell's stuff. I'll YouTube it. It's on there. Should we fight for mainline churches or start new ones? Too simplistic to say yes or no, but my default is fight. My default is genuinely to fight. But when I say that, I would say that actually does involve fighting, not simply staying without fighting. Because I think some people say, oh, we're going to stay here and fight, and then no fighting occurs. They just allow their denominations to slide into liberalism and decay, and if you're going to stay and fight, you need to actually fight, and that means you need to know what victory looks like, and you also need to know when the fight is lost, or when you are not going to be able to be the one fighting that fight, at which point you should leave. So I am for fighting, but I think they are worth broadly fighting for. Firstly, because well, actually, I think there's a few things. Their cultural heritage. People sacrificed a lot to build these churches. Now, the church is not a building, and so a group of people gathered in a barn or a field or a big box church as opposed to a big, nice classical cathedral. I prefer a classical cathedral for everything except acoustics, which are difficult for a band, but besides the point. But the church is not remotely defined by that, and we all know that, and that's... But nonetheless, people have built these things, and we shouldn't just hand them over to false churches or apostate churches or enemies of the gospel, or they shouldn't become mosques, and they shouldn't become Weatherspoons or whatever else it may be. So we don't want that. We want to retake them because the infrastructure matters, the buildings matter, the cultural capital matters. There's centuries of work behind them. It also has been the case that some of these fights have been won. When Bible-believing people actually fight, they often get victory. Aaron Wren has some good stuff on this. The video you put in there, Josh, in the comments. Aaron Wren has talked about this. He has interviewed a guy on it. He's talked about some denominations that have been saved from liberal slides. One of the Lutheran denominations had a real turnaround, and it ended up that rather than the liberal side taking over and the conservatives leaving, the liberal side left. The conservatives managed to win the argument, and the new liberal denomination disappeared pretty much immediately because liberals can't actually build a church. They can only take over an existing church. No offence to liberals, but you need to repent. So it probably depends a little bit on how bad it is. There's a few challenges on this, right? So obviously if you've got kids, suddenly becomes harder because they're being discipled there. If you've, you don't want yourself or those you love to fall into compromise, and that is a danger. And so there is that come out from among them side of things. That's a real thing. What union has Christ and Belial? All those are light and darkness. Like, that's a thing. That is a thing. So, but I think you can stay, you can fight. But again, it should be a real fight. Luther attempted to do this. This is what Luther tried to do in the Roman Catholic Church, and he got kicked out. So he made a real fight, and he got really kicked out, and then he started the new thing. Broadly, I've had some experience of this where I picked an issue that I felt needed to be fought on, did fight on it as best I could, and lost. From the perspective of that church, my arguments didn't get heard or responded to well. And I didn't do so disrespectfully, but I did fight, and I ended up having to leave because it became untenable. That happens, right? So if you're going to fight, you fight. C.S. Lewis, what are his best books? Two answers to this, which is it depends on what topic you want to hear about, right? Because, books are it's like saying what's the best tool? Well, depends what you're doing. You have a saw. If you need to cut something, but you're trying to drill something, saw is not going to do it. So which is the best C.S. Lewis book? The first answer is depends on the topic. The second answer is it's the Screwtape Letters. Sorry. Horse in my throat. Horse in my throat? Frog in my throat. Horse voice. Whatever. It's the best book in terms of, for the broadest audience, for most people, super easy to read, and most useful to the broadest audience. I need to learn to speak English. It would really help with the whole YouTube channel venture. It is fantastic. For me, it's the best book on sin that I've ever read, and I've read a lot of the classic, these are the best ones on this topic. For me, if you want to understand how sin works and how it gets in different ways, Screwtape Letters, absolute win. My personal favourite book of C.S. Lewis's is That Hideous Strength. I believe it's incredibly prophetic. I've referenced it in videos before. And now to read it, you have to read out of this, because it's the third book in a trilogy. It's very distinct from the first two, though. In order to read it, you have to read Out of the Silent Planet, which is kind of an easy, fun read, and Perelandra, which is excellent, but also incredibly difficult, and I hate the ending so much. But that's just because it's a big, long monologue for like 100 pages. I don't know. He's doing the whole, C.S. Lewis has the whole Greek mythology, medieval literature thing, and he does that there, and lots of it's very good, and then it just becomes like, could we just wrap it up? The story's over. Come on. So, but that said, once you get to That Hideous Strength, you have a book that you will reread regularly, as far as I'm concerned. Narnia is also fantastic in terms of teaching values, big ideas in a way that's intuitive. I think that's the benefit of good fiction, is that things like that, rather than being taught in a non-fiction, sort of, here's what thou must do in this situation, it gets an intuitive understanding of big concepts and big ideas. So Narnia is also great. Some of his stuff I'm not as big a fan of as everyone else. I don't think The Problem of Pain is a great book on suffering. I think it's an okay book on suffering. What else do I not like? I don't know. I don't think the Abolition of Man has some good points, but I don't know. I don't think it's his best work in terms of clarity and broad appeal. You have to be operating at a pretty high level of understanding what was going on at the time in order to understand the Abolition of Man. That Hideous Strength is a more interesting way of putting forth similar concepts. So it's the fiction version of the Abolition of Man. Right, 1 Timothy 2:12. Why have I got two questions about women in ministry from two different people independently? Thank you very much for this. Let me try and push a couple of them together then, these two questions about women in ministry, male-woman roles. This is a massive topic. Full books have been written about it. Massively long series have been done about it. And just tends to be that it opens up a lot more questions rather than just giving a simple, straight answer. But allow me to try and give a relatively simple, straight answer. I've read a lot of books on both sides, and I am not fully convinced of the egalitarian point of view, which is that I don't think that men and women, so my current view is I don't think that men and women are fully interchangeable when it comes to the senior position of church leadership in a local church context, which is what I think this is about. I'm not convinced of that position. I don't think you can get there without doing some gymnastics with the text that I would not do with any other text. So that's my honest answer on it. I think that one of the big issues in society today is that we tend to think that men and women are fully interchangeable. All of the sexuality stuff, all of the you can say feminism, a lot of the equity ideology is that people are just completely interchangeable in any context whatsoever, and in particular men and women, and I just don't, the Bible does not teach that. You can't say that men and women are fully interchangeable. There are things that men can do that women can't do. There are things that women can do that men cannot do. When it comes to this particular text of 1 Timothy 2:12, that's the one about do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. It says women should be silent in the churches is the beginning of that. That obviously does not mean total silence, right? It just doesn't, because the same author, Paul, writes in 1 Corinthians about a woman praying and prophesying in church. He's not schizophrenic, so as far as we know. Anyway, I don't believe that. The Bible is not schizophrenic. So he didn't advocate for full silence. That's not what he's talking about there. The book that gave me the best answer on this particular text was a Two Views on Women in Ministry book, and actually the appendix in that I thought was the best unpacking of this. Now, I'm reliant on scholars because I haven't done original languages, and even if I did, I wouldn't be good enough to do it better than a scholar. So I rely on scholars. But the scholar there, I believe, was Craic Blomberg. I think he's the editor behind that. This is from memory. he said that wording of teach or have authority, actually, when you look at how Paul uses that and how he's using that in 1 Timothy, is kind of teaching and having authority. And he ties it then to basically that role of the senior teaching authority in a local church context. Now, different contexts will play that out differently. So you might have a church which is a real, like, totally elder-led and it's totally spread between them. Most churches, though, that looks like the senior pastor. So that is actually my take, is I think that every role in church leadership is broadly open to women as we currently define church leadership roles in most church contexts, except for that role of the senior pastor, which I think should be the role of a man. That's what I think. I think we see that that's sort of in the Old Testament as well. There was only one role that women couldn't take. Women could be judges, women could be prophets, but they couldn't be priests. Same in the New Testament. Women could do lots of other things, can do lots of other things, do lots of other things. But I think that senior teaching authority, that is ideally supposed to be for a man. I'm going to give some caveats here. Firstly, that means that outside of that local church context, hey, go for it. So like teaching in a seminary, leading in other areas, preaching under that authority, I think is okay. Speaking at conferences, speaking at seminars, yes. I'm all for that. I think there are circumstances as well where I think this is an ideal. I don't think he's saying that this is a sin. And I think there are contexts where it might actually be appropriate for the woman to be a senior pastor. So whilst I hold that view, I view it as an ideal. Some contexts where that might be, and I have heard of being the case, persecution in the church where the men are getting arrested. Well, what do? You can either not have church or you can have women take up the leadership of the church in that vacuum. I want women to take up the leadership of the church in that vacuum. They're not sinning, they're doing a good thing. If you have no qualified men, then I think you can have a female senior leader. So a good analogy for that would be a female missionary. If a female goes as a missionary, a whole bunch of people get saved. There are no men there who are able to teach, who understand Christianity to any level. Well, then, yeah, I'd much rather have a woman in there doing that. I would also say that even though I think that that's the ideal, if you have a church which believes this, which believes egalitarianism, believes that men and women can do all of the roles without caveat, then sometimes God may call a woman to do that, even though it's not his ideal. I think we see a lot of time God does things that are not his ideal, because he actually still wants to bless people. So I'm not opposed to it. So there's an answer that will satisfy no one, annoy everyone, and I could be wrong. I hold this very lightly. I hold it as a third level doctrine. So I would say first level doctrines are like, if you don't believe this, you're not a Christian. Second level doctrine is, you don't believe this, you're a Christian, but like we probably can't go to the same church. And that can vary because it depends on the other issues around that. So if you've only got churches that you disagree with first level, then you got to go to church at the second level. But I would put this as third level, where like you have people in the same church that completely disagree on this. I don't think you have people in the same church very easily who disagree on. You could. There's maybe I don't know if that's a good distinction or not, actually, but that's how I've had it in my head. You've got like state borders, and then you've got like national borders, and then you've just got like just disagreements within the state or whatever. So I think that's quite a good analogy for certain issues, and you got to weigh up where those ones are. But I'd be quite happy to go to a church. So for instance, I would struggle to go to an infant baptism church because I don't want my kids to get baptized. I'd like them to get dedicated. And then baptized as believers. So that would be where I would want to go. I would struggle to go to that church. I wouldn't struggle that much to go to a church with like a female pastor couple or something like that. I wouldn't be opposed to that. And you got to weigh that up. The best resource on this, by the way, that I've heard is Mike Winger's stuff. If you have the time to listen to it in double speed. He does very good work on it. Okay, Amy, your question. Sorry that it's taken me so long to get to them, but they're big questions that I'm getting asked today. Ergo, takes time to answer. Are there still demons in the world today? And how do you know if someone has one? Yes, there are still demons in the world today. I have met a few. I've encountered some demons in my time. I've encountered people manifesting demons. Not a lot, okay? I'm not saying I've encountered that many. But that should be no surprise to Christians. When you read the Bible, we're told that demons are going to be dealt with finally at the final judgment, which is not now. So they will be dealt with at the return of Jesus. And up until that time, we will interact with them in various contexts. But, we have victory over them in Christ. So I'm not worried about interacting with demons. It doesn't particularly concern me. It's something that will happen, though. I think we do see different sorts of demons. So you ask about how do you know if someone has one? Not all demons actually work in that way. I think that's important to recognize. We do see in the Bible, you see tormenting spirits. We see that a fair bit in the ministry of Jesus. And we see it with Saul, for instance. But we also see other demons, and we think we can also base this off what angels exist. So we see, for instance, the Prince of Persia in the book of Daniel. That's a demon over an area. That might be, some people would call that a power or a principality. I think we do see that. We see this concept of watcher angels and them falling into sin. So you have spirits working in different ways. So not all demons are ones that people can quote unquote have. But there are still demons like that people can quote unquote have. In terms of having a demon, how do you know if someone has one? People have talked a lot about this. People have different perspectives on this. And the idea of having a demon is tricky because the Bible doesn't talk about being demon possessed. The Bible talks about being demonized is the word. It just means to be affected by a demon. I think there can be levels of that. So I think in some way all of us are going to experience attacks from demons. Some of them, you can have people where it gets to that point where the oppression is so strong and they've opened themselves up to it broadly or been opened up because of, say, trauma or some other issue, where you do see like demons manifesting through people. That's not always the case. I think we see these things in the Bible as well. You see sometimes you have, Jesus deals with a woman with a spirit of infirmity. The only sign of that is that she's bent over. She's not got voices or, chains or any of that. She's being afflicted by a demonic illness. That's a thing, right? But then we also see Legion, or the man with the demons called Legion, and they're saying, we're Legion for we're many, and he's breaking chains and he's completely crazy and he's living with the pigs, and so there's just different levels of that. So I wouldn't broadly worry too much about making distinctions. How do you know if someone has one? Big question. Firstly, I would say I wouldn't stress too much yourself. Like, if that's a question about you and yourself, just be faithful to Jesus and walk through your walk with God, and be open to receiving prayer for things and see what happens, but don't be worrying, do I have a demon of yada, yada, yada. Broadly speaking, sometimes... I've experienced times where I feel like there's been deliverance in my own life. How did I know I had one? I didn't. And I don't even know if I quote unquote had a demon, if that's the right term. But I've definitely experienced moments of prayer which had real breakthrough and some supernatural stuff happened. And it just came in those moments of prayer. So how do you know if someone has one? Well, discernment of spirits is a gift. Sometimes it's pretty obvious if the person's like freaking out and doing strange voices and saying strange stuff, and if you ask them, can you say Jesus is Lord, and they can't or refuse to say that, it doesn't take a genius to go, I think that may be a demon. The head's turning 360 degrees. Never seen that. I don't think that's actually happened, but there have been lots of weird things that have happened. You got to figure it out in the moment. I wouldn't worry about having one. To be honest, I wouldn't honestly stress too much about it. I know that sounds stupid, but if you're a teenager and you're asked, that's a great question to ask, but don't be worrying, because you just live faithfully to God, whatever way you can. and be open to receiving prayer. Yeah, that's maybe not the best answer ever on that, but it's my best go. There was CFC did actually a good series on this with a guy called John Thompson, so I would check him out. Jon Thompson. He's got some good stuff on this. I think his stuff was broadly pretty good, very helpful on this issue. They did a big 2-day conferencey seminar thing, but you can find his stuff elsewhere online. He's good, so that's where I would point you in that direction. If asked about feminism, I just talked about it in response to another question a little bit. I am not a feminist and don't agree with the ideology of feminism. That's not to say that nothing feminism has ever said is true, because all of these things are powerful because some of what they say is true. But I could point you to a really good series on it by Sheologians. This is where my being okay with women doing ministry thing actually is helpful, because I can listen to them and enjoy it. They did a really good series a few years ago on it. I'll post a link. I think they call it Feminism is Poison. Nice non-controversial title, but they talk through the history of feminism and give some very good sort of, look, here's who we're talking about here are the issues. So I will point you to that. In terms of Andrew Tate, I'm actually going to do a video this week on the manosphere, if I ever stop doing this video, because this one's getting long. Apologies. Broadly, look, Andrew Tate, not a good guy, right? Just important to say that. I don't know if he's a criminal guy, because he was held for months without charge and then was charged, but we don't know exactly. It seems odd that they wouldn't have charged him in the first 2 months when they had him in jail. It's not right to jail someone for 2 months without charge. However, so what has happened to him, I actually don't agree with. I think it was a sense of, it may have been. I don't know. Not in the ins and outs. But you shouldn't hold someone in a prison cell for 2 months without telling them what crime you think they've committed. Anyway, Andrew Tate shows us, I think, that being anti-woke is insufficient. If we treat wokeness, I view wokeness as a religious ideology. If we did that with any other ideology, we say, well, let's equate it with Islam, right? Not being Muslim is not enough, right? I don't agree with Islam, but I don't want everybody to just not be a Muslim. That's stupid. They actually need to, the true religion need to believe the right things. So he makes some valid criticisms of wokeness, and he says some stuff that's pretty obvious in terms of about men and men's, that men have some, so he has a following because he says that men have some sort of value in this life, and, that they're not completely identical with women, and it's pretty obvious stuff. But at the same time, where it lands for him is it's all about making money and it's all about sleeping around, which is what Jesus would describe as a fool. He has not got the right answer. He has noted some issues with wokeness, but the life of a Christian is much more than that, and Christian masculinity is much more than that, and Christian virtue is much more than that. And he displays none of those things. He doesn't display a strength of character. He doesn't display self-sacrifice. He displays sort of machismo. That's what he displays. That's not the answer. So I don't think Andrew Tate is an important figure. I don't think his ideas are going to be with us down through the generations. I think he's got a bit of social media clout because he says some stuff that's controversial, some of which has some truth in it, but he seems to be a pimp and potentially even involved in trafficking, made his money from cam girl websites. Andrew Tate, I'm not pointing anybody in his direction for anything resembling truth or goodness or virtue. So anyway, thank you guys very much. Sorry, long response video, lots of questions there. I really enjoy these questions. Some of them I'm going to turn into videos. I'll have to do that. Thank you for your support as always. Appreciate it. See you soon.